The other day, I was listening to a podcast from Diary of the CEO where he interviews two of the co-founders of Love Lab. And some of the interesting things about that podcast that they brought up is that many of us typically know when a relationship is going wrong, but how do we know and make a relationship more healthy, good, and going right in the right direction? Like, what does a good, healthy relationship even look like? And so instead of addressing so much of the wrongs, but it's also just as important to give people an alternative. How should you be acting instead of criticizing or blaming other people? What are some ways that you can make them feel loved? What are the most important things that are the keystones to a healthy, growing relationship, despite all of the hurdles that will definitely come our way? And here on my channel, I like to advocate that if you don't quite know something yourself, I think it's always great and important to get inspiration from the world around us. And so in today's video, I wanted to share 8 things that I noticed among my parents, among my friends, that I could tell made their relationships prosper and stronger. And when they also use it on me, I also feel really good. And that is something I want to carry forward in my romantic relationships as well. Number 1 is what the co-founders of the Love Lab explain as bids for attention. This is usually seen in experiments or moments where they observe a couple and how they interact. And let's say one couple sees something outside the window and they say, hey, look at that Shiba Inu dog there walking with its owner. How the other partner responds can usually give you a hint towards how their interactions are as a couple. If your partner, is busy with something but takes the time to look and be like, oh, that is quite interesting, then they are reciprocating, your call for attention. And that's usually a good sign of a healthy relationship. Versus if you see that maybe the person's ignoring the person, or even if they actually start criticizing the person, like, who cares about a stinking dog, you can get a good sense of how that relationship's going. And I see this healthy relationship trait often within my friends and their relationships. So for example, they would look at something and be like, oh, hey, so-and-so, look at this. And it's a really small, minor thing, but they are very attentive to each other's bids for attention just naturally. And it feels very nice. And a second trait of good, healthy relationships is when your other partner is thoughtful and considerate and does things for you without feeling entitled to get something in return. Some people ask, what is the difference between manipulation versus influence? And I feel like manipulation tends to be that if someone's doing something good for you, but they're expecting you to act or treat them in a certain way in return, then that is a bit of manipulation. Versus they can influence you to be a more thoughtful and considerate person. Or let's say they do something for you, they don't expect anything in return from you. They already feel good from the act of caring for you. And you, in return, if you are a self-aware person, if this is not your natural inclination, maybe you live so long alone, then over time as a self-aware person, you would also want to show how much you care in return and to do those acts of service. Sometimes it's something as small as my friends asking like, hey, I'm gonna go out and get some snacks. Do you want anything? And I'll be like, oh yeah, can you get me a bottle of water? And they do that for me. And I'm like, wow, thanks. And so for some, being a considerate and thoughtful person is the natural thing that they were raised with. But in the case of, let's say, maybe you are someone who's a little bit more selfish, or you lived a life mostly taking care of yourself and not used to taking care of others. In that case, this is a learned skill, right? It is possible to learn how to become a more caring and considerate person. For me personally, I used to be pretty hyper independent, and I realized that was hurting a lot of my relationships, because just as how it is good to give someone help and care, it is also important to be able to learn how to receive care and help. And for a long time for me, that was pretty difficult. I feel like I was pretty blessed to meet some people who pointed that out about me, like, hey Brenda, you should like ask us for help sometimes. And I'm like, no, I can do it myself. And I realized at the time that to ask for help for me seemed like it meant that I felt less capable, or it would be admitting that I was a less capable person, when that's not true. The person that you are with or the friends that I'm with and things like that, they already should know that I am a capable person. They already know. You don't have to prove it to people. And once you learn that, then it's more of a matter of like, oh, I want to help them because I love them, and they just want to help me because they love me. And just because we can do something by ourselves doesn't mean we have to do something on our own. And you'll find that when you're able to receive and give help, that gives you an opportunity to develop closer relationships with people. Because if you're busy doing your own thing and they're busy doing their own thing, there are less opportunities to reaffirm the bonds that tie you two together. And that brings me to trait number 3, which is how these partners view problems. So for example, is it a us versus the problem, or is it a you problem? Oftentimes when partners see a problem and they blame it on the other person, I usually notice that the conversations don't go well. In comparison, a lot of partners who say, like, even if it's like maybe one person who's mostly struggling, like, hey, I see that you're struggling with this. Is there anything I can do to help you with that? Or maybe you guys are having miscommunication, and instead of blaming it on the other person, they say you two are on the same team. And so the question isn't so much like, what are you doing wrong, but like, how can we both find a middle ground together to solve this problem of miscommunication between us? And trait number 4 is listening, which I was guilty of previously. I wasn't really a good listener. I grew up as a yapper and everything's about me. But since then, I have learned through the help of my introvert friends how to be a better listener. I'm sure we have natural inclinations to being extroverted or introverted, but we can always learn from the other side of the spectrum. But in general, active listening usually comes from a place of not just listening and parroting. Those are kind of what I did in the beginning, but over time I learned to just be very curious about the person I'm talking with and giving them my full attention, curious what they're worried about, what excites them, why they think the way they do, and how do they think the way they do. You can ask these questions and it becomes very fun. You will actually never fully understand a person, but you can always strive to understand a person. And the more you have that desire to understand your partner, I think you're on the right path to being a good listener. And I think that's a great trait to have, not just in our romantic relationships, but in our relationships with people in general. Okay, and the 5th trait that I notice about relationships that I really love and I'm supporting and rooting for around me is that most of the two couples have quite distinct personalities. They are two wholes coming together and not so much like two halves coming together. And the way you see this is while they enjoy each other's company, I feel like they really enrich each other's lives with their separate wholeness. When I see the way my friends in a relationship look at each other, I feel like they really appreciate that other person's individuality. They make the active choice and desire to want to work and live together. In comparison, what a half and half relationship may look like, and one that I've also been guilty of, is feeling like I need the other person in order for me to feel whole. That is pretty much a codependency, and how you know this is if the person is away from you, you kind of have like an anxious attachment and you feel like, oh, I don't really feel good when they're gone. You actually should be able to feel good about yourself even when that other partner is not around. And that usually requires a practice of self-love and finding your own sense of self separate from a relationship. I know there are a couple of people who are able to find their sense of self in a supportive, loving relationship, but in a codependent one, I feel like that's quite difficult. The best way I can describe it is the other day, my friend and I were talking about this idea that if you don't really love yourself or value yourself, what tends to happen is when you fall in love with someone, you fall in love with the idea of them. And often the idea of them is actually a projection of your own needs or what you are lacking in yourself, which could be lack of self-love, self-worth, validation, things like that. And what's interesting is when you project onto someone, you don't really love them for them. You end up loving them for your idea of them, and when you get into a relationship with them, you get to know them more, and the reality doesn't match your expectation. You become pretty unhappy in your relationship because that relationship is not fulfilling the need that you actually want, that you can only give yourself through self-love and through self-worth and through building up your self-worth, building up your own sense of individuality and self. Versus in comparison, when you do feel self-love and are grounded in your self-worth, what ends up happening is that when you meet people, you're not really projecting. You instead just look at them for who they are, and you're more curious about them as a person. You're not pushing on your expectations of a partner or what you want or in a partner. You just observe them and hang out with them and be like, hey, I like myself. I can tell I like this person. And when you know your own self very well, you know who you like, you know your likes, you know your dislikes, therefore of things, but then also of people. And from there, you make the active choices of wanting to get to know the person better and then eventually choosing to be in a relationship of them. All of these are within your control, and it doesn't feel like a pull of like a craving or a desire, because when you are lacking in self-love or self-worth or validation or a need that you have, and that person starts to feel more like the person that you have a crush on, starts to feel more like a drug, right? It's very passionate love, very, I don't know, emotionally addicting, maybe psychologically addicting even. And that's something you kind of have to work over through time. I could make a separate video about what the self-love, self-worth process looks like, because I feel like, we can just say love yourself, but what the F does that even mean? Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like? How does that show up in your day-to-day life, in how you think and how you interact in the world? Because there is a general way of being and existing, but I feel like if we grow up in an environment with people we surround ourselves with that don't model that kind of peace with ourselves, then it's hard to see how we would get inspiration and apply that into our own lives. I do think so far that there are many types of love, the passionate ones, the romantic ones, the lustful ones, but there's the one that seems to last the longest. The long-lasting ones tends to be the ones where it's not super passionate. It might be passionate sometimes, but it seems to be there's a common theme of a person feeling safe, feeling love, feeling like they're getting enough attention from their partner, and feeling secure in their relationship. And at some point, the person feels like home. And you can tell a lot about how you feel about a person based off 3 factors, which is how does your mind feel, how does your heart feel, and how does your gut feel. Your gut helps with trust. It's usually a bit illogical, but it's a sense. It's like a third sense. Your heart matches with emotions, and your mind may work towards like fears or worries, insecurities, logic, but also, stimulating conversation, witty banter, and curiosity. So I'd like to believe that a lot of relationships, especially romantic relationships and the long-lasting ones, tend to be an alignment of all 3: our mind, our heart, and our gut. For your gut, do you feel safe? Do you trust this person? And in your chest, do you feel warm? And then in your mind, do you feel stimulated when you talk to them? And you can talk to them for hours about anything. The important thing about 2 wholes coming together is that you can never fully change a person. The person has to decide themselves, but you can help support them on their journey to change. And it really helps if the 2 people in the relationship are both open to change and growing together. And trait number 6 of a good, healthy relationship, or how to be a good partner in a relationship, is not worrying about the little nitty-gritty details. And I'm a bit guilty of this, but I really admire and look up to my parents' relationship in this regard, because sometimes something my mom says or does really annoys me, or sometimes something my dad says or does really annoys me, and I'm complaining it to my opposite parent. And it's quite amazing. I talk to them in separate instances, and both of them are able to defend the other person. Sometimes I'll be like, why don't you feel this way about mom? Don't you think it's kind of annoying when she does this? Or to my dad, like, how do you deal with mom? This, it bothers me. And both of them have given me similar responses on different occasions. The other person's not in the room. They really see the bigger picture. Like, oh, I know your mom is lacking in this in a while, but I can tell as we're getting older, she has less energy, and she's always already done so much for the family for, the X number of years of our marriage that, like, it's no big deal. And I was like, what? Or my mom being like, yeah, your dad has these shortcomings, but you have to remember that he's done all of these blah, 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 XYZ amazing things. And so both of them always have the bigger picture in mind, which is the harmony of the relationship, not getting caught up in the little annoyances, and instead focusing on the positives of the other person, of their partner, of the relationship, and always remembering the contributions that each has put into the marriage and relationship and family unit. And I think that's so beautiful. I'm a bit lacking in that. When I heard those things, I was like, I'm a bit immature right now. Y'all, it feels like they just flipped a mirror at me and like, you're being immature. And I'm like, I probably am. But yeah, I'm working on that. And trait number 7 is a relationship where both of the partners make an active, conscious effort to keep the relationship fresh, go out on dates, celebrate the other person, and having open and hard conversations, and instead of threatening to break up at any small sign of conflict. One example is one of my friends has been with her partner for more than 7 years now. They recently got married and they decided, you know what, we want to spice up our relationship, we want to go on dates again. And so for them, they schedule intentional dates once a month with each other, and they get to try out something new and enjoy time with each other. And that's something they actively choose to do. It's kind of like a personal ritual or tradition in their relationship. And I think that's so beautiful. That looks a little bit different than, say, my parents, for example. They're not really interested in going on dates that much, but they always like to go Costco shopping together, and that's their weekly thing that they do every week. And last but not least, the 8th trait is being able to survive the seasons of a relationship. This is something that cannot be tested in the short term. This is something that simply comes from long-term relationships and facing different problems that life throws at you, your partner, and the 2 of you together, and how you overcome them, and that's probably the best way to be developing trust, but also seeing if your shared values last. Will you evolve together? Oftentimes, there's sometimes a mismatch of a partner who does not want to evolve or change while the other partner is doing that. And let's just say I haven't seen those relationships work out that well. So I think it's so important for both partners to be open to those changes together. That being said, sometimes two people go in completely different directions in life and it won't work out. And it's not because it's not the partner's fault, but other times it's going to work out really well. And yeah, those are some of the 8 traits of good, healthy relationships that I've noticed in my family, my friends, and how people have interacted with me that have tied to both great romantic relationships, but also just great, fulfilling, platonic, friendship, any kind of relationships in my day-to-day life too. It has enriched my life so much. I am always continuously trying to be a better communicator. Of course, I don't think I'll ever be perfect, but I think it's the effort is what matters, supporting others who do the same. And if you also enjoy discussing life and relationships and how we can show up better for the people that we love around us, then please click subscribe below, because I would love to create a community of people like us where I'm not perfect. I don't think you're perfect either. None of us are, but it's always a continuous practice and it's fun to be growing and sharing our ideas with each other. And see you guys in the next video. Bye.